In the year of 2227, the Institute led a raid into Vault 111 in order to capture untainted pre-war human DNA for their Generation 3 synth program. To this end, baby Sean was chosen as the ideal candidate, who was then stolen from the grasp of one of his parents that he shared a cryotube with. The other parent, who becomes the sole survivor, is declared the backup and refrozen before being woken 60 years later into the future, ostensibly as a science experiment for Sean, who has now become the director of the Institute. Multiple webs of fate are unleashed once the sole survivor leaves the vault into the world above. In their journey in the wasteland, they're able to assist either the Brotherhood of Steel, the Minutemen, the Railroad, or the Institute to lay claim to the region. However, despite the multiple options, 3 out of 4 of these lead directly to the destruction of the Institute itself. So if the sole survivor never survived, or if they never left the vault, the Institute would have ultimately been the victor in Fallout 4. In this hypothetical scenario, the day arrives where the sole survivor was released from the vault, but they never do. Maybe they're still in there, but Sean never decides to release them. Maybe Sean does decide to release them, but then discovers that due to system malfunctions, the sole survivor never made it. Or perhaps when Sean himself was first taken, Kellogg decided to clear up all the loose ends and eliminates the sole survivor. Whatever the scenario, the end product is that the Vault 111 elevator never brings the sole survivor back to the surface to make their mark on the Commonwealth. So why does this lead to an immediate Institute win? Well, firstly, no sole survivor, no Minutemen. While the existence of the Minutemen doesn't immediately threaten the Institute, after all, they can be pulled into an uneasy alliance by an Institute-aligned general, but they are a force that is able to topple the faction. However, if the sole survivor does not ever leave the vault, the Minutemen are doomed. In fact, so clutch was the sole survivor's rescue of Preston and the company, that had they been awoken a week later, they would never have been able to save them in time. Either the raiders who were literally at their barricaded door would have broken through, or Preston's exhausted party might have succumbed to the deathclaw that was attracted to the noise. Prior to this, the Minutemen were already a spent force. Its numbers dwindled, and they were ineffectual at achieving their goal of protecting the people of the Commonwealth. And although it was a noble goal, Commonwealth residents themselves became disillusioned with their idealism. Even when the sole survivor starts completing quests, people comment that they thought the Minutemen were done for. The only reason it was able to get a breath of life was due to Preston championing the cause. Without the sole survivor, there's no one to rescue Preston. Without Preston, there's no one to strive to get the Minutemen back off the ground. And without the Minutemen returning to power, they don't retake the castle, they don't maintain bases across the Commonwealth, and they certainly don't lead a fire team into the bowels of the Institute and blow it up. During the directors' meeting of an Institute playthrough, the Minutemen's operations at the castle were reported as being under observation, with the SRB considering them to be a potential threat but at the moment contained. It's important to note that a Minutemen aligned sole survivor is able to rejuvenate and unite the Commonwealth to a level only seen once prior, that being the Commonwealth Provisional Government. The Commonwealth Provisional Government was an entity that brought all the large settlements of the region together into a coalition, one that could have mirrored the NCR. The Institute were also given a seat at the table. However, having deemed a united Commonwealth a threat to their ongoing experiments and even their existence, the Institute decided to gun down all of its representatives. An organisation of similar power was not even thought of until the sole survivor rolled up, built some settlements, and rallied a group of wastelanders with laser muskets to be powerful enough to storm one of the most technologically advanced civilizations in the known world. In the war against the Minutemen, the greatest move that the Institute could have ever taken was a preemptive one, not releasing the general of the Minutemen out into the world. Now, the next factor would be the Railroad. If the sole survivor never made it out of the vault and out into the world above, then their chances of accomplishing their core goal would have been 0 to 0. At the time of Fallout 4, the Railroad is a shell of its former self. Safe houses have been shown to be infiltrated and attacked by the Institute, with barely enough time to take valuable technology with them. Their key agents were reduced down to Deacon and Glory, with all others falling in battle. Evidently, without influence from the sole survivor, the Railroad did maintain a robust network of informants and agents across the Commonwealth and the wider wasteland that aided in the goal of guarding synths out of the region. They also seemed to hold enough sway to form a hard military group that was able to stand on its own, as shown in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Still, without the sole survivor, this is essentially all they can do. Help synths out of the Institute and out of the Commonwealth. It's not to say it isn't a noble goal, and indeed it is one of their key objectives. But it's kind of like putting sticky tape over a leaking fire hydrant and expecting it to stop. You might get a little bit, but it's really not doing too much. The Railroad had their contact within the Institute, Liam Benet, codenamed Patriot, who helped send synths up to the surface. However, without the sole survivor, they had no actual way of getting into the Institute itself. And that's a fairly common point for basically this whole video. Every single faction had no way of accessing the Institute without the unique opportunity that the sole survivor had. Namely, that he was able to figure out that they used teleportation, although didn't anyone notice synths bursting out of nowhere for years and years, and not get killed when he entered the place since it was Sean's plan all along to have him there. The Railroad would have literally had no way to stop the Institute in any way, shape or form. All they could have done is just rescue synths and move them onto another location. And given the dire state that the Railroad was currently in, it's also very likely that they would have eventually fallen to the might of the Institute eventually. When backing the Institute, the sole survivor is tasked with entering the HQ and eliminating all the representatives in the building. The Railroad are then categorized as neutralized. There are agents mentioned to still be operating semi-independently in a post-game status, but they're not really considered a threat. However, this indicates that if the Institute were able to enter the HQ, they too would have been able to wipe out the Railroad entirely. And while the Railroad are masters of being sneaky, it's a logical conclusion that the Institute would have eventually found their hideout. For one, its passcode is Railroad. Second, it's difficult to understand how they couldn't have just tailed one of the Railroad's known heavies such as Glory or Deacon back to the HQ. And even if the Institute never located the HQ, the Railroad would just not have been able to do much else other than rescue the odd synth that came their way. The Institute wouldn't have been too happy about it. After all, they view the interference as stealing their property at best and tampering with dangerous technology at worst, but the Railroad aren't an existential threat to the Institute. All the Railroad can talk about is the Institute, whereas the Institute refers to them, and I quote Sean himself, as a minor nuisance. The Railroad is supporting a specific side of one conflict, synth liberation, whereas the Institute, or the Brotherhood, or the Minutemen, are concerned with the fate of the Commonwealth as a whole. And it's only with the assistance of the sole survivor that the Railroad are even able to accomplish this one goal. Without them, they're nothing, and their war against the Institute is a stalemate at best, or an annihilation at worst. The foe that the Institute fears the most in the war for the Commonwealth is the Brotherhood of Steel. If the sole survivor is awakened by Sean and joins the Brotherhood, they then join them in a crusade against the technological abominations found in their labs. Similar to other pathways, the Institute is blown up and the Brotherhood prevails. Having the sole survivor awakened and joining them in their missions allows the Brotherhood to secure victory. What is interesting with them, however, is that, unlike the Railroad or the Minutemen, they were not entirely dependent on the sole survivor. The Brotherhood had sent numerous expedition teams into the Commonwealth ostensibly to scout for technology. It is theorized, however, that they had been aware of the Institute's existence for quite some time and deemed the group a potential threat. Dr. Lee became aware of the group from the visit of Dr. Zimmer, the then head of the SRB of the Institute at Rivet City. Having then aided the Brotherhood in activating Liberty Prime, she chose to head up north, having heard stories of the technological wonders of Dr. Zimmer's organization. It's unknown if Dr. Lee had told the Brotherhood directly about the Institute, or where she was even going, but it's also likely that in the 10-year time gap, travelers and merchants from the region would have spread tales about the Institute. Paladin Dance's team picked up high-band energy readings that were determined to not be pre-war in origin. Upon reporting said readings, the Brotherhood then sent their most powerful asset, the Pridwin, and the leader of the West Coast faction to immediately declare war on the Institute. And this occurs even if the sole survivor helps Dan out or not. Either way, the reports reach Maxon and he comes charging in head first. Without the sole survivor, it's difficult to determine exactly how the conflict between the Brotherhood and the Institute would play out. The Brotherhood would have no doubt realized that the Institute uses teleportation, and they had already theorized that they might be underground near the CIT. But without the sole survivor, it's unlikely that they would have ever been able to send an agent into the Institute. One could argue then that had the sole survivor not survived, they'd never be able to recruit Dr. Lee, and without her, Liberty Prime would not be up and running, except they can. In a playthrough where the sole survivor either kills Dr. Lee or is banished from the Institute, they're instead instructed to recruit Professor Skara, a scientist found in Diamond City. Skara is able to fulfill the exact same role as Dr. Lee would have, being able to bring Liberty Prime back to full operational power. However, the Brotherhood would have still needed to acquire a beryllium agitator to power Liberty Prime. The quest to obtain the agitator from Mass Fusion becomes the key component in determining the Brotherhood's fate in the Commonwealth in this non-sole survivor world. Except the issue is that the Brotherhood probably would have never been able to lay their hands on it. The Institute would have already taken it for their own. Father could have sent a team to retrieve the agitator at any point. He only delayed the mission as he wanted the sole survivor to undertake it. Specifically, he wanted it done by them after the board meeting that declared the sole survivor to be his heir as a director of the Institute. By allowing them to be the one to complete the mission that literally advances them into the next stage of power, it helps solidify their control. Institute scientists reverently refer to Sean as father for providing the genetic blueprint that led to the next generation of synths. With the sole survivor providing the means to power the nuclear reactor, the people of the Institute would come to look to them in a similar light. Keyword on light, as it would be they who ensured that they stayed on for the next millennium. But technically, the sole survivor isn't even needed to obtain the beryllium agitator, which was the key ingredient needed for the Institute to activate their nuclear reactor. In their quest to obtain the technology, waves of Brotherhood soldiers are fought against, but the Institute technically could have just gone and grabbed the tech at any time. Sending their synths or Corsa probably would have been more effective, as the agitator is surrounded by an incredibly high dose of radiation. And so without the sole survivor, the Brotherhood don't even have the chance to power Liberty Prime, the only weapon that they had that could have allowed them to stop the Institute. At best, they could have been an occupying force in the Commonwealth. However, in a war of attrition, the invaders are usually in a worse position than the defenders. The Institute under defense are technically untouchable in this scenario. Their food and water supplies would not run out. They wouldn't even really lose any manpower, as they'd be able to just send up their synth forces against the Brotherhood troops. And on the other hand, the Brotherhood would be contending with a foe that can strike at will anywhere they want to, yet they can't strike them back. The Brotherhood's food and resources would eventually dwindle, leading to them either impoverishing themselves by purchasing it from Commonwealth residents, or harden resistance against them by taking it by force. Each paladin, knight, or scribe in their arsenal is a finite resource, one that could be eventually exhausted. And even the Pridwin itself can't stay afloat indefinitely, as evidenced by Proctor Ingram's discussion when requesting the sole survivor to find Coulin. In the war against the Institute, without the sole survivor, the Brotherhood would eventually be forced to leave the region, leaving the Institute as the sole power in the Commonwealth. In the sole survivor's interactions with the main factions in Fallout 4, 3 out of 4 factions rely on them to secure their hold of the Commonwealth. Indeed, in the case of the Minutemen, they rely on them for their very existence. But for the Institute, the sole survivor is not needed at all. Take the previously mentioned mass fusion quest from earlier. If the sole survivor had never been woken, the Institute would have swooped in to take the agitator yonks ago, and they most likely would have done it before the Brotherhood could even contend them for it. The quest that follows this one in an Institute playthrough is to kidnap T.S. Wallace, a wasteland scientist, which also doesn't necessarily need the sole survivor to be completed. Wallace is targeted by the Institute, who deem him necessary to assist with their reactor project. In response, he hires either the Minutemen or the Gunners as protection, who need to be dealt with. Now, surely these troops would be easily waylaid by Institute synths, so that's not a factor. But even after this, if the sole survivor fails his speech checks to convince Wallace to come peacefully, a synth teleports into the room and transports him back to the Institute. It's legitimately a quest in which the sole survivor is basically a bystander. Even the Battle of Bunker Hill didn't even need the sole survivor to accomplish the Institute's aims. Kellogg, still being alive in this scenario, would have been able to fulfill their role. Coursers would have also accomplished the exact same thing as the sole survivor did, and maybe even better, as they might have just stealth boyed all the way to the basement before issuing the recall codes and then teleporting the synths back to the Institute. Without the sole survivor, they evidently don't succeed Sean as the director of the Institute, but it was only in the year of 2287 that this was even a possibility. Prior to this, any of the division heads might have been a possible contender for the position. It's hard to know who it may have gone to, but I imagine that with Dr. Ayo too combative, Dr. Lee too new, and Dr. Holdren too out of the loop, the title of director would have gone to Ali Fillmore, the head of facilities, who father seemed to hold the most trust with. The powering of the reactor was as much a passion for Ali as it was for father, so it's undoubtable that the powering of the reactor would have been a key agenda in her administration. With it powered, the Institute would have been able to dominate the landscape. Its synths would begin patrolling checkpoints of the Commonwealth that establish a presence in major settlements such as Diamond City, and their underground lair would remain powered till the end of time. More synths, technology, and equipment would be able to be produced as the Institute reached the absolute zenith of their power. And even at worst, if the Institute never acquired the beryllium agitator to start the reactor, they could still be considered the victor. When the sole survivor is released into the world, the wasteland is one in which the Institute basically had already won. Wastelanders speak of them in whispers, accusing their own loved ones of being their agents, with no united effort to bring them down being possible. The status quo, or Fallout 4, is one that would suit the Institute just fine, as they're virtually unopposed in treating the Commonwealth as their own special lab experiment. Essentially, once the Vault 111 elevator brought the sole survivor out to the world, the Institute had a 50-50 chance at survival. And if the sole survivor remained buried forever, the Institute would win outright. Having lived all his life in the rigid doctrine of practicality, Father potentially dooms his people when embracing his one purely emotional action to release his parent. If he adhered to his own principles, he secures the future of the Institute and redefines mankind. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed, and if you want, please subscribe, ring the bell, and watch a couple of my other videos to support the channel. Thank you, and I'll see you around like a rissole.